Hey y'all, I'm Carrie,
I'm Momo.
and this is Monstrous. This episode contains discussion of murder, violence, abuse, and disturbing details. Listener discretion is advised. All right, welcome back, everybody.
Oh,
All right, so today we're going to head into the world of fame, power, and the terrible things that can happen when someone with money, status, and a long history of frightening behavior is given one more chance to be alone with a vulnerable person. So, this is one of the ones that you picked, Momo.
oh, okay.
Yep. So this is the story of Lana Clarkson, a woman with her own dreams, her own career, and her own life, whose name forever became tied to one of the most infamous murder cases in Hollywood history. Our episode today is not about a monster in the usual sense of the word. It is about a real person who was loved, admired, and remembered by the people who knew her, and about the man who ended her life in a mansion filled with music, money, and control. It is also about how long it can take for the truth to finally stick when a famous man is standing on the other side of it. So if you're ready over there,
Yeah, I guess so.
all right. Lana Clarkson was born in Long Beach, California, but she spent most of her early life in Sonoma County, far from the glare of Hollywood and the dark corners of the entertainment industry. She grew up in a family that, by all accounts, loved her deeply. She had a big personality, a bright smile, and the kind of natural charisma that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Friends and family remember her as warm, funny, and spirited, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and make it feel lighter just by being there. Lana was the daughter of Donald Dan Clarkson and Donna Donnie Clarkson, and she had a brother named Donnie. Her family was close knit, working class, and as close to ordinary as any family in California could be. That grounding meant that even when she was later known for her height and her looks, the people who loved her still saw her as the same girl who'd grown up in Sonoma, the same sister and daughter who had driven them crazy with her jokes and stubbornness. As a child, Lana was drawn to horses, to movement, to the feeling of doing something active and physical. She was tall, striking, and beautiful, but she was never just a face. She was athletic and independent, and she carried herself with a kind of confidence that made sense the moment you looked at her. When she was still young, Lana's family moved south again, and she eventually found her way back into the orbit of the entertainment world, where beauty and ambition often went hand in hand, but where very few people ever made it for long. So even as Lana began to move more fully into acting and modeling, she stayed connected to her family. Her parents and siblings saw her as someone who worked hard, who didn't cut corners, and who never pretended to be something that she wasn't. That sense of loyalty and pride stayed with her throughout her life, even when the industry tried to reduce her to a pretty face in a genre film.
She was very pretty.
Yeah, I seen pictures. She was. This was one that I had absolutely no idea who this was. It was a little bit before my time.
Not too much.
Okay. So Lana had spent years building a life in an industry that rewarded beauty, punished age, and rarely gave women the security that they deserved. She kept showing up anyway, though, taking the work that came her way and hoping that the next opportunity might finally be the one that changed everything. But while Lana was trying to hold on to her dream, another figure was already looming at the edge of this story, a man whose name carried fame, money, and a long trail of troubling behavior. By the time Lana Clarkson had met Phil Spector, she was no longer just chasing the old Hollywood dream. She was also leaning into the cult film world and the convention circuit, where she could still be recognized, appreciated, and respected. She was still taking photos, still signing autographs, still modeling, and still trying to stay relevant in a business that too often discarded women who didn't stay in the spotlight. The night Lana met Phil was not her first attempt to find a new chapter. It was one more shot at finding a way forward in an industry that rarely gave women a second act, So, like I said, Lana was born in Long Beach, California in 1962. And from the beginning, she had seemed like the child who carried light with her. She was raised partly in Sonoma County in Northern California, where her life was a little quieter and much less glamorous than the world that she eventually broke into. Her family was close. The people that knew her growing up described her as loving, energetic, and full of life. She was not the type to fade into the background. Her parents, Dan and Donna, were central to her life, and her brother Donnie was a constant presence as she grew up. Lana's family was the kind of family that showed up for birthdays, holidays, and the small moments in between. And that stability mattered as she later navigated an industry that gave her no guarantees. Even early on in life, Lana had a personality, drive, and a real sense of self. Her mix of athleticism, humor, and confidence stayed all the way throughout her adulthood, even when her roles dried up and the work became harder to find. She carried herself like someone who expected to be treated with respect. That sense of self worth would matter a great deal on the night that she would walk into Phil Spector's house. Now, some point, like I said, her family moved south, and she eventually found her way toward Los Angeles, where she began to imagine a future in entertainment. Like a lot of young women who came from California with big dreams, Lana was drawn to the idea of acting and modeling. But unlike many people who just talked about it, Lana went for it. She started with modeling, and that opened the door to screen work. Lana was ambitious, but she also understood that the road she was choosing was going to be hard. She also understood that in Hollywood, being a woman over 30 meant fewer roles and more competition. But that didn't stop her. It did, though, shape the kind of work that she was willing to take. She did not turn down conventions or genre films just because they weren't prestigious. She knew that being remembered by fans at a convention table could mean more to her life and career than a single forgettable TV guest spot. Now, the thing that made Lana stand out in Hollywood was that she never seemed to see herself as just another hopeful face. She wanted to perform and she wanted to be remembered. And so she kept trying, even when the industry did what it often does to women like her, made her work hard for everything and gave them only a few chances to really break through. And by the time Lana had hit her 30s and 40s, she had become one of those actors who knew her worth even when the industry pretended not to. She was still booking jobs, still showing up, and still letting people see that she was not just a face from a VHS cover, but instead a real person with a story of her own. Her film career began with small parts, but one of the earliest roles that would later become widely remembered was in Fast Times at Ridgemount High. Did you ever see that?
Yep.
Yeah? I never watched it. Obviously, I never watched it, but did you like that movie?
Yeah.
What was it about?
High school kids.
Oh, well, I feel like that's in the name though.
No, seriously. That's all it
Like
was
just
high
a
school kids.
like just a life as a high schooler?
Pretty much.
Oh, that's boring.
Yeah, but you gotta remember the times, honey.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. So her appearance in this was small, but the film itself became iconic, and Lana's presence in it became part of her screen legacy. Now, over time, she would move into more genre work, including cult films that gave her a stronger fan following. One of the biggest of those being Barbarian Queen, a sword and sorcery film that let her play a fierce, physical, larger than life character. Did you ever watch that?
Yes, I saw it, and I thought it was one of the dumbest things I ever seen.
Tell us how you really feel. What was wrong with it? Like, what was it exactly about?
A barbarian queen.
I don't know what that means. I know, I probably sound stupid, but I have no idea what that means.
Um,
A barbarian, I think of like somebody like a caveman kinda thing.
well, the Vikings were barbarians.
Really? I
Yes.
just call them the Vikings.
No.
Oh, okay. So her role in this film in particular became one of the things that people really remembered her by. In fact, what people remembered her by the most, because it matched something real about who she seemed to be: strong, determined, and willing to take up space. These films gave her
I like that. I like that.
she was a she had a big personality, and she wasn't gonna hide it.
and she shouldn't.
No, you shouldn't. You are who you are.
That's right, and if they don't like it, on 'em,
Mhm. So
and
these
that's exactly how I feel about it.
right. Now, these films also gave her a different kind of stability. While the mainstream industry moved on, the cult film world clung to her image, and the fans kept her name alive. That meant more conventions, more signing events, and more chances to be seen publicly. Even when she was no longer auditioning for network television, people still wanted her. Now, Lana had also worked in television and other film projects besides these. Like so many other actresses who were not household names, she'd kept pushing to stay visible. Hollywood became brutally unfair to women who were not at the center of the machine, and Lana's career reflected that reality. She had beauty, presence, and talent, but she still had to hustle. That meant auditions, small roles, genre films, public appearances, and constantly trying to keep the momentum going. Now, by the time Lana had reached her 40s, she was still working and still trying to build something that would last. She had not become a major star, but she had carved out a place for herself in the world of working actors and cult film fans. That matters because too often people flatten a victim's life into the single night that they died. Lana was not just someone who walked into Phil Spector's house. She was a woman who had spent her entire adult life trying to make something of herself in an industry that often treats women as disposable.
And that's very true.
And it's still true for today. Like, let's be honest. Now, Lana Clarkson was not just a woman in a cult film or a tragic headline. She came from a full family, parents and siblings who loved her long before Hollywood had ever heard her name. Her family was close knit and they were working class. They were the people that showed up for each other. And that sense of loyalty seemed to stay with her even as she moved deeper into the entertainment world. Her parents and brother Donnie all saw her as their daughter and sister first, and a Hollywood actress second. That meant that even when she was known for her roles in Barbarian Queen or Fast Times at Ridgemount High, those who mattered most to her still saw her as that same girl that they grew up with, the same person who would make them laugh at their kitchen table. That close knit family gave way to her confidence and her self worth, which carried into her adulthood. She did not become someone who let men or the industry power trip over her. She pushed back, she stood up, and she kept trying to write her own story, even when the script kept changing without her consent. Now, Lana's relationships outside work also shaped who she was as well. She loved deeply, she dated, and she had friendships that last. She didn't just exist in the world of set life and conventions. She had a private life, private joys, and private hurts too. The fact that Lana never had children or that she never settled into a stable long term marriage in the same way that people expected didn't make her life any less real. It made her life hers. Those relationships are part of what gave her life color. She was not just a woman who wore costumes and stood in front of cameras. She was someone who could cook, joke, argue, and stand her ground in a way that made her friends feel safe around her. Now, her career in Hollywood was one of persistence. She showed up for auditions that never went anywhere. She took small roles that most people would have forgotten about and kept working steadily even when the parts weren't glamorous. She did guest spots, genre films, and convention appearances, and she built a quiet, devoted fan base that kept her name alive long after other actresses in similar positions would have faded from memory. The fact that she was still working at the time that she met Phil Spector was not a detail buried in this case. It's a central part of who she was. And by the time she had met Phil, she was in a phase of reinvention. She was trying to balance her cult film status with whatever new opportunities that she could find. She was still hosting, still modeling, and still doing the work that kept her financially afloat and emotionally engaged. That meant that she was not someone who had given up on her life. She was someone who was still in the middle of it. Lana's family, especially her parents and siblings, knew her as more than just that single night in a mansion. They knew her laugh, her stubborn streak, her work ethic, and the way that she could still make them laugh even when she was tired. They knew her pride in what she had built, even if it never matched the success of the people that she admired. For them, Lana's death was not just a legal case, it was a rupture in their family. They lost, they lost their daughter, sister, niece, and the friend who had grown up with him, not just the actress whose name would later appear in true crime headlines. Now, her relationship with men, including boyfriends and other romantic partners, were part of how she navigated an industry that often treated women as, like I said, disposable. Some of those relationships were healthy, others not so much. But what matters is that Lana had her own interior life, her own needs, and her own sense of self worth, something that she was trying to defend even as she walked into Phil's house. That inner life is important because it means that she was not a passive object in Phil Spector's story. She was a woman who had her own history, boundaries, and her own reasons for trying to make it through the night with dignity intact. Lana was a woman who had a whole life sketched out behind her decisions, a woman who loved, lost, worked, failed, and tried again. She entered Phil Spector's world not as a blank page, but as someone who had carried her story, her family, and her ambitions with her. That is the part of her story that we need to hold on to before the murder is ever told. Because, like I said, so often these victims are etched down to that one single night. You don't hear about their whole life and who they were before.
Oh, no. Once they die, that's it.
And it's awful because that's what happened to them, but that's not who they were. And if you're going to honor a victim and talk about them, then you talk about their whole life, not just what someone else did to them.
Right.
It's and it even happens on TV like that.
Mhm.
It's ridiculous.
It is ridiculous, honey.
Now, we're gonna move on from Lana, and we're gonna talk about Phil Spector. Not gonna lie, I had no idea who this guy was. I had to Google him.
He was a record producer.
Yeah,
He was a producer of some sort.
once I seen his
He was a goofy looking
oh, yeah. Once I seen his face, I remember I had seen his face before, but I had
probably
no
with
idea.
trial,
Probably.
but he was goofy looking. He's goofy looking.
Oh, yeah, I had no idea who this guy was.
It's
This
like, "Lana, you are so beautiful. What the hell you doing with him?"
like I said, I had no idea this is one that you picked. I didn't know nothing about it. One of the ones in the book? Yep, this is one of the ones that you would pick.
You're gonna put more paper in.
That might be the last one. I think that might be the last page. Okay. Uh, so Phil Spector was born in the Bronx in 1939, and the story of his early life is one shaped by loss, displacement, and talent that seemed to arrive early and hard.
Damn, he was 20 she was born in 62,
Yes, April 5th of 62.
and he was born in 39?
Yeah, so he was over he was
21. Well, he's 21 years older than me, who made him 23 years older than her.
mhm.
Dude, get a freaking life.
That's how it goes, those old creepy
This
men.
is
So Phil's father had died by suicide when he was still a child, and that death left a mark on him that people around him would later point to.
that's kind of
Again,
sad.
right. I couldn't figure out how old he was when his dad died, but he was little. And people
He
would
was a
point
little guy.
yeah. Now people would point to this later again and again when trying to understand the man that he would become. Now after his father's death, his mother moved their family to Los Angeles, where Phil would then grow up in a very different world from the one that he had left behind. That early loss shaped the way that Phil saw the world as something that he had to control in order to survive. Where other kids might have reacted to tragedy by withdrawing, Phil responded by leaning into power, performance, and the need to be the center of attention, which is never a good thing. As a teenager, Phil was already drawn to music and showing the kind of confidence that could easily turn into control. Throughout in high school, he began to build a reputation that would later define his career. Brilliant, intense, determined, and impossible to ignore. In 1958, while still a teenager, he helped create a hit with To Know Him Is to Love Him as part of the Teddy Bears. That song launched him into the music business in a way most people can only dream of. Do you know that song?
Yep. You don't want me to sing.
Oh, God.
Correct. No, I'm serious. You don't want me to sing.
From there, he kept expanding his reach. Phil didn't just produce records, he produced entire careers, shaping the way that singers sounded, looked, and the way they were marketed. The man who had once been a teenage songwriter in the Bronx was now a behind the scenes emperor who could make or break artists with a single phone call. From there, Phil became one of the most important record producers of the 1960s. He developed what came to be known as the Wall of Sound, a lush, layered production style that made his records feel enormous. He worked with many major artists and built a reputation for having an ear for hit records and a vision for what pop music could sound like. He was also a founder of the Phillies Records, and for a time, he was seen as a true genius, one of those rare people who could shape an era. Phil produced early hits for the Crystals, the Ronettes, the Righteous Brothers, and even the Beatles, among others. The way he stacked instruments, voices, and echoes together created a signature sound that shaped not just singles, but entire albums. By the late 1960s, Phil was no longer just a behind the scenes talent. He was the kind of person who could take a raw song and turn it into something that felt like a miniature movie. But even in the middle of that success, there were signs that Phil Spector was not just difficult, but that he was also dangerous. He was known for his temper, his control over the people around him, and his erratic behavior. Now, eventually, Phil would marry a woman named Ronnie Spector, and that marriage later became one of the most famous examples of abuse and control in the music world. Ronnie has spoken for years about how frightening the relationship was. Ronnie has described being locked in a room with guns pointed at her, forbidden from leaving, and made to feel like she had no control of her own life. The kind of control that does not go away just because a marriage ends. Her accounts are what helped cement the image of Phil, not just as a genius producer, but as a man who used power the same way that he used music to dominate. Ronnie has also described how Phil would isolate her, cut her off from friends, and terrify her with displays of violence, all while telling her that no one would believe her if she ever tried to leave. That combination that combination of fame, fear, and financial control made it almost impossible for her to walk away cleanly. And the scars of that relationship stayed with her long after they finally divorced. Now, Phil Spector wasn't just a producer who suddenly snapped one night. He was a man whose entire life was a story of genius, trauma, control, and a very long, very public pattern of behavior that should have warned everyone who came near him. At the heart of that pattern, there was a simple rule: Phil needed to be in charge, and anything that threatened his control made him volatile. Women who crossed him, tried to leave him, or questioned his decisions often found themselves on the wrong side of his temper. His childhood, that was marked by his father's suicide and a mother who had to rebuild their lives from the ground up, left a deep imprint on Phil. The loss of his father at such a young age was one of those experiences that can turn a person inward, and that's exactly what it seemed to do to him. Phil grew up in a house that carried the weight of grief, even as his mother tried to keep things going, and he responded by throwing himself into music very early, seeing it as one way that he could shape the world around him into something that he liked. That need to shape the world became an obsession. He would go to the studio, surround himself with musicians, and try to mold the world around him. That obsession carried into his later years, where he treated his mansion like a private kingdom, and the people that came into it as temporary guests. Phil Spector was a man who had been celebrated for his music, but who had also been feared by people who knew him best. The case that emerged after Lana's death did not just change his legal status. It forced the world to confront the fact that his genius had been wrapped up in a history of control, intimidation, and violence that had long been hidden in plain sight. Now, by the time Phil reached the years of his life, his career had dimmed, but his reputation for validity had not. He had money, a mansion, and he still had a famous name. Along with that, he still carried himself like someone used to getting what he wanted. He also had a long history of carrying guns, intimidating people, and behaving in ways that made others nervous. And that matters, because when Lana Clarkson met him, she was not dealing with a harmless recluse. She was dealing with a man who had spent a lifetime building a world around his own control. Phil Spector was in the room that night at the House of Blues, and by the time Lana Clarkson crossed paths with him, he was already a man carrying decades of power, money, and fear all around him. The details of how they met are important because they show how ordinary the beginning can look before a case turned catastrophic. So Lana was working. Phil was just out in public. And what happened next would become the kind of encounter that people later replay over and over, trying to figure out exactly where the moment of no return actually was. Now, by all accounts, the evening started as a normal night out in Hollywood. Phil was with his driver and his bodyguard, and Lana was working at the House of Blues. At some point, he had spoken to her, and the interaction grew into an invitation. This all happened in early of 2023, a quiet, rainy start to the year that would turn into one of the most high-profile celebrity murder cases of the decade. Now, Lana eventually left with him and went back to his home in Alhambra, the strange fortress-like mansion that had become part of his own, that had become a part of his legend. That house had long carried a reputation, dramatic, imposing, and full of the kind of energy that people often describe only after feeling something terrible happen there. And by the time they were inside, Phil was already in the mood that he was known for: drunk, armed, and volatile.
Drunk, armed, and stupid.
Pretty much. Now, people who had been with him before that night described the way his mood could shift without warning, and the way that he always seemed to have a gun in his hand whenever he was in that state. The combination of alcohol, guns, and a woman who had walked into his world hours earlier set the stage for what would come next. What happened inside that house would become the center of two trials and years of legal argument. By the time the night was over, Lana Clarkson was dead, shot in the mouth in the foyer of Phil Spector's home. The question that would haunt this case for years was not simply what happened, but how anyone could have gone from a late night meeting to a fatal gunshot in such a short amount of time. At the heart of this case, the question was simple. Either Lana Clarkson had ended her own life in Phil Spector's house, or she was murdered by a man who had spent decades using guns, money, and intimidation to bend the people around him. The jury had to choose which of those stories fit the evidence best. When police first learned what happened, the scene already carried the weight of a tragedy that did not make sense on its surface. Phil Spector had reportedly told his driver words to the effect that he thought he had killed someone. That statement and the condition of the scene would later become part of the fight over whether Lana's death had been murder or suicide. The prosecution would argue one thing, the defense another, and the physical evidence would become the battleground. This was, by the 2000s, one of the most widely watched celebrity murder cases in years.
Oh, yeah.
Did you watch it?
Well, I watch it through court TV, you know, but I didn't watch it.
How wild was it?
It was just there was all kinds of motions and different stupid just stupid shit.
The typical stuff that they do.
Celebrity crap.
Were you
Yeah.
living in California at the time of this?
What year was it?
2003?
No,
No? You
I
were
was in North
already in
Carolina.
North Carolina? Okay. Debbie was still in California though, wasn't she?
Yes.
Was? Oh, I should have asked her about this before we did it. Dang. She should have.
I don't know if she paid any attention to it or not, honey.
I bet she did. It's Debbie. I bet she did.
Point taken.
Debbie, you have to give us the lowdown. You gotta let us know what the craziness it was so we can tell all of our listeners how wild this thing was. All right. Okay. Anyway. Okay, so this was one of the most widely watched celebrity murder cases in years. It was a story that blended Hollywood, true crime, and music history. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department homicide unit took over the investigation. Obviously, it was backed by the coroner's findings, gun evidence, gun evidence experts, and a team of prosecutors who had followed Phil Spector's history with women for years. The,
Oh, yeah, he was always in the tabloids
for just being
being him,
crappy or
for
just
just
in
being
general.
him.
So the basic roles of the investigation were clear: responding deputies, lead, ho- lead homicide detectives, the coroner and medical examiner who ruled this was a homicide, and forensic specialists who analyzed the blood spatter, gunshot residue, and the weapon. Solana's body was found in the foyer, and the forensic details would matter enormously in this case. She had been shot through the mouth with a 38 caliber revolver, and the position of her body, the condition of the scene, and the injuries that she sustained all became crucial pieces of the argument over what really happened that night. The coroner's ruling that this was, in fact, a homicide and not a suicide became the foundation for the state's entire case and the central line that the defense would fight over for years. Lana was transported to the morgue, where the coroner would begin the painstaking work of reconstructing what had happened in those final seconds. One bruise, one fragment of tooth, and one gunshot residue fleck at a time. Like I said, the coroner ended up ruling her death a homicide. And that mattered because it cut directly against the suicide theory that would later become the defense's main argument. The autopsy showed not only the gunshot wound itself, but also bruising on Lana's wrists and arms, signs that suggested she may have been grabbed or even restrained. There were also injuries to her mouth and teeth, including teeth that were broken and tooth fragments, which prosecutors would later argue fit with the gun being forced into her mouth rather than Lana simply pulling the trigger herself. Now, the medical examiner also described the angle of the wound, the blood pattern, and the overall scene in a way that made it difficult to reconcile with a self inflicted shot. The prosecution's forensic experts went further, walking the jury through the likely trajectory of the bullet, the splatter patterns, and the way the gun had probably been pressed into her mouth at close range, all of which pointed away from suicide and towards a struggle. Another major issue Another major issue was the presence of gunshot residue and blood evidence. The defense tried to build a case around the idea that Lana had been depressed and had died by suicide, but the state pushed back hard, arguing that the physical evidence didn't fit that story. The prosecution pointed to the bruises, the angle of the wound, the blood pattern, and the condition of the weapon as signs that this was not a self inflicted death. They also argued that Lana's clothing, purse, and the overall scene did not support the notion that she had calmly or deliberately killed herself in Phil Spector's house. The coroner's ruling that this was a homicide, not a suicide, became the foundation for the state's entire case. Witness statements became important as well. Phil Spector's driver, Adrino de Souza, testified about what he heard and saw that night, and his account became one of the most important pieces of testimony in the case. He described hearing a gunshot and hearing Spector say words to the effect of, quote, "I think I killed somebody." That line would be repeated over and over because it sounded like an admission, even if the defense tried to explain it away. Then there was Phil himself. When police and investigators came to the house, he gave a series of explanations that shifted over time, and that inconsistency hurt him. One of the reoccurring problems for the defense was that Spector had a well documented reputation for being armed, controlling, and frightening when drunk. The prosecution leaned into that history,
Like I s
arguing
like I said, armed, drunk, and stupid.
the prosecution leaned into that history, arguing that this was not a random one night disaster, but the end result of a pattern of behavior. The investigation also uncovered the broader context of how Phil treated women. His long history of threatening, erratic, and intimidating behavior did not by itself prove murder, but it did help the jury understand the kind of man that they were looking at. This was a case where character evidence and forensic evidence worked together, and prosecutors worked hard to show that Lana Clarkson was not just tragically unlucky, that she was in a house with a man who had a long track record of making people afraid. 5 women had come forward over the years to say that Phil Spector had pointed guns at them, threatened them, and forced them into humiliating or terrifying situations when he felt challenged. That testimony helped the prosecution argue that this was not the first time he had used a firearm to control or frighten someone. The first trial was where the case was really turned into a spectacle, because by then it was no longer just about one dead woman in a mansion. It had become a story about celebrity, power, addiction, firearms, and whether a jury would believe that one of the most famous producers in music history had murdered a struggling artist in his own home. So the prosecution opened by painting a picture of control and violence. They argued that Lana Clarkson was not suicidal, that she was not in a state where she had calmly decided to end her own life, and that the evidence pointed instead to a confrontation. They emphasized the bruises on her wrists, the injury to her mouth, the broken teeth, and the forensic findings that suggested the gun had been fired at close range, with the weapon likely being forced into her mouth. They also brought in testimony about Phil Spector's behavior on that night and his history with women, trying to show the jury that this was a larger pattern of intimidation and abuse. The defense, meanwhile, went all in on that suicide theory. They argued that Lana had been drinking, that she was depressed, and that she may have shot herself during a strange emotional encounter with Spector, which she had just met this man. That doesn't even make sense.
Yeah, but back then, honey, women were very wild.
Oh, it just, I'm sorry, it doesn't make sense.
I know.
Out of all places in the world, why would you shoot yourself in some stranger's home?
Man, shoot yourself in the damn mouth.
You know what I mean? Like, that doesn't even make sense. Anyway, the defense also tried to challenge the prosecution's forensic conclusions and create doubt about whether the injuries necessarily pointed to murder. In a case this high profile, the defense did what defense teams often do. They tried to make the evidence look less certain than it appeared. Expert testimony became one of the most important battlegrounds. Forensic specialists, medical examiners, and gun experts all took the stand, and each side tried to frame the physical evidence in the light most favorable to its theory. The bruising, the blood evidence, and gunshot wound were all dissected in painful detail. The prosecution said the evidence pointed to struggle and force. The defense said it was inconclusive and that the scene could still support their version of events. Basically, in the end, this trial became a battle of the experts. Even with all the evidence that was there, in the end, that's what it became. Now, the trial also drew enormous media attention because Phil Spector was such a huge public figure. He was not just any defendant. He was an aging music legend with a famous past, a history of bizarre behavior, and a courtroom presence that made people nervous. That level of fame turned the trial into a circus at times. The reporters, observers, and legal commentators all treated it as one of the biggest celebrity murder cases in years, which it was, but in turn it became a shit show, basically.
Yep.
And when the first jury finally deliberated, they could not come to a unanimous decision. So the result was a hung jury, which meant there was no conviction and no acquittal, just a legal reset. For Lana's family, it meant waiting even longer for justice. For Spector, it meant the case was not over and the state was going to try again. Now, the gap between the two trials meant that public opinion had hardened. The evidence had been debated for years, and the stakes felt even higher when the second jury finally reached its verdict. Now, the retrial was very different in tone, even though the core facts were all still the same. But by the time the case went back to court, though, the prosecution knew what they had done wrong the first time, and they came back more focused. The defense, of course, still leaned into that suicide theory, but now both sides had the benefit of everything that had already been tested in the first trial. The second jury was not seeing a blank slate. They were seeing a case that had already been fought once and was coming back even sharper. Now, the legal system was giving the story a second chance to stick, not just for the headlines, but for the people who had lived with this loss for more than a decade. This time, the state again argued that Lana Clarkson's death was a homicide and that Phil Spector had the means, motive, opportunity, and history to support a murder conviction. They went back to the bruises, the broken teeth, the mouth wound, the blood evidence, and the testimony about Spector's behavior that night. They also emphasized his pattern of carrying guns, frightening women, and behaving in ways that made him dangerous when he was drinking. The prosecution wanted the jury to see the whole picture, not just the final moment. Second degree murder meant that the jury believed Lana had been killed intentionally. but not under the kind of planned, premeditated scenario that would have qualified as first degree murder. That, that classification grounded the verdict in what the evidence showed: a deeper encounter rooted in Phil's history of violence and control, not a cold, long planned killing, but instead a deliberate act. The defense continued to insist that Lana died by suicide. They tried to keep the they tried to keep alive the idea that she was emotionally unstable and that the shooting could have been self-inflicted. But the prosecution had a stronger case the second time around, in part because the jury had already heard many of the arguments and because the overall weight of the evidence was hard to ignore. The retrial was still dramatic, but it did not feel as open-ended as the first one did. After deliberation, the second jury found Phil Spector guilty of second-degree murder. He was also convicted on the firearm enhancement, and that verdict meant that the jury rejected the suicide theory and accepted the prosecution's version of events: that Lana Clarkson was murdered in Phil Spector's home and that killing was not accidental nor self inflicted. The sentence would come later: 19 years to life in prison. Spector was taken into the California prison system, where he remained until his death in 2021. He died that January, on the 16th, at the age of 81 years old, from complications related to COVID-19. Phil Spector's death in prison brought the case full circle. Once he sat in a mansion surrounded by fame and weapons. Now he was just another inmate living out the terms of a life that had been shaped by his own choices and his long history of violence. Over the years, his conviction had been appealed, but the conviction stood again and again. For Lana's family, the verdict did not erase what had happened, but it did finally provide a legal recognition of what they and the prosecutors had been saying all along. For Phil, the prison sentence became a final chapter to a story that had always been about power, and now at last it was about accountability. The outcome of the case changed Phil Spector's legacy forever. He had once been celebrated as a musical genius, but after this conviction, his name became synonymous with murder, control, and abuse. For Lana Clarkson, the case gave her a permanent place in the public record, but it also reduced her entire life to one single night in a mansion. That is why it matters to tell her story from the beginning, because she was more than just the way she died. Lana Clarkson should be remembered as a woman with a life, a career, and a presence that mattered long before her name became tied to Phil Spector's murder conviction. She was an actress, a model, a daughter, a sister, and a person who kept trying to build a future in a difficult injury that rarely made room for women to age gracefully or thrive without help. That is the part of what makes her story so painful. She was still working, still hoping, and still showing up when her life was cut short. Phil Spector's story, by contrast, is one of talent warped by control and fear. He was undeniably influential in music, but influence never excuses the way that he treated people or the violence that followed him into the final years of his life. His conviction didn't just end a legal battle, it permanently changed the way that the public understood him. The genius label could no longer stand on its own. What makes this case endure is that it sits in an intersection of celebrity and accountability. Lana's death could have been buried under fame, money, and legal delay, but it wasn't. The investigation, her autopsy, the testimony, and the retrial all forced the truth into the open. And in the end, the jury rejected the story that Lana killed herself, and they decided that she was murdered by Phil Spector inside his home. This is a reminder that the most dangerous monsters aren't always the ones hiding in the shadows. They're the ones who walk into public life with charisma, money, and fame, and who are allowed to keep hurting people until the world finally stops looking away. So when you close out this episode, remember that Lana Clarkson was a real woman with a life worth remembering. And Phil Spector was a powerful man whose behavior had long been troubling. And this case is about what happened when those two worlds collide in the worst possible ways. It is a story about violence, but it is also a story about persistence, a family refusing to let her be forgotten, and a justice system that eventually got there.
Yeah, he was a crazy dude, I'm telling you.
Yep. That's the murder of Lana Clarkson.
It's you never know what kind of people, so don't pick up people in bars.
Watch for the red flags.
Exactly, watch for the knuckleheads.
Yeah. Did that go the way you thought it was gonna go?
Yeah,
Yeah, do you remember all of that?
yeah.
Yeah. I didn't know anything about this one.
I didn't think you would because you
Mm-mm.
were you were young when it happened.
Yeah, I was like 9.
Yeah, and 9 years old, you don't give a shit
Yeah, right, right.
on who's shooting who and with what, and
If it wasn't on your TV, I had no idea what was going on.
I know. Well, usually during the news time, you were over having dinner
Mhm,
or you were in bed already.
mhm.
So, yeah, you didn't get to see a lot of it.
Yep.
Well, you didn't see unless you spent the night with me.
But then it was, like, usually, like, the first 48 or Cops, something like that,
Yeah, you'd watch that with me.
where it didn't have, like, all the gruesome, like,
They didn't
things
show
they
all the
showed.
gory
Right,
details,
right, yep,
and Cosby was just funny.
yep. Or I was playing, solitaire or Tetris on one of your little hand game things.
Yeah,
Yep, yep. Anyway, that's that one.
that was pretty good.
Yep. Okay. Are you ready to hear what we're gonna do next week?
What we doing next week, my
Okay.
friend?
Next week, we're gonna cover a case that never should have happened. This is also one that you picked.
I'm on a
Mhm.
roll.
It's a story that starts with trust and ends in violence. Leaving
I
behind
hate those
I
kinds.
know. Leaving behind a family shattered and a community asking how things went so wrong so fast. It involves a military connection, a brutal loss, and a chain of events that spiraled before anyone could stop it. What makes this one especially unsettling is how ordinary it may have seemed at first. But underneath the surface, everything was already moving toward tragedy. By the time the truth start started coming into focus, too much had already been taken away. It's the kind of case that stays with you long after it's over. You don't have a clue, do you?
No, I don't know which I picked so many of them though.
I know.
I don't remember, and I didn't write them down.
Yep, that's that one.
Okay.
So, guys, come back. Make sure you give us a rating, a review, hit subscribe. Make sure your downloads are on so that way when that one drops, you get it and your device automatically downloads it so you can listen to it anywhere, whether you have service or not. If you wanna keep up with us between episodes, all of our socials are linked in the episode description. You can also get photos, case snapshots, and all of those extras on Facebook and on our TikTok page. So make sure you go and follow those. If you have a case that you think we should cover or a story of your own that you'd like to share, our email is also in the description. Send those over to us. We love to hear from you guys. And that's it. So we will be back next week. Guys, I know I promised you a bonus last week. I'm sorry, it has not come out yet. We had some unforeseen circumstances happen, but it is coming. I promise. It is on its way. Um, and then I will have another bonus, a couple other bonuses that'll come out after that one. So keep an ear out for those. I will be announcing those once those are those dates are official. So we got some exciting thing I don't wanna say fun because that's awful, so it's not fun. But it's some exciting things coming that you guys are gonna like. So make sure you have all of the things like followed, subscribed, downloads on, that way you guys hear them as soon as it drops. And we'll be back next week. Till then, make sure you stay safe out there, and remember to
Watch out for monsters.
and don't kill people. Bye, y'all.
Bye, y'all.